Alright, let's talk about one of the most enigmatic and tragically doomed civilizations in the history of Warhammer 40k, the Eldar Empire. Before the Imperium of Man even crawled out of the dark ages of Terra, before the Emperor of Mankind had begun his great crusade, before the galaxy had been shaped into its current brutal and war-torn state, there was the Eldar. They were not just rulers of the stars, they were the stars, bending the galaxy itself to their will, shaping entire solar systems as effortlessly as an artist paints on canvas. Their empire stretched across real space and beyond, into the labyrinthine tunnels of the Webway, a domain so vast and sophisticated that no other race, not even the ancient Necrons, could rival its grandeur. The Eldar weren't merely an advanced civilization, they were a psyker race. Every single one of them possessed a connection to the warp, their psychic abilities so refined that they could shape matter, construct living starships, and manipulate reality itself. Where humans rely on crude machinery, the Eldar willed their technology into existence. Their cities were built not from metal and stone, but from psychocrystalline wraithbone, structures that could shift, grow, and repair themselves at the command of their creators. Even death was not a true end for them. Their souls, untainted by the horrors that now haunt them, would dissolve peacefully into the warp, only to be reborn again in new bodies. Immortality of a kind was their birthright, and yet, despite their unimaginable power, the Eldar were not content with mere dominion. They believed themselves to be the rightful rulers of the galaxy, a race destined to reign supreme for all eternity. Unlike the lumbering Imperium or the expansionist Tau, they did not conquer the stars, they created them in their image. Planets were terraformed to suit their every need, entire systems reshaped into idyllic paradises where Eldar could live in absolute perfection. No war, no struggle, no hardship, only peace, prosperity, and a civilization so advanced that the mere concept of arrival seemed laughable. But therein lay the seeds of their downfall. When a species is unchallenged for so long, when it reaches a level of perfection beyond measure, what is left to strive for? The Eldar, for all their greatness, had no threats to face, no conflicts to test them, no external enemies to challenge their supremacy. And so, they turned inward. They sought new ways to entertain themselves, to stimulate their ever-hungry minds and heightened emotions. And as we'll soon see, that hunger would become their undoing. This is the story of how the Eldar rose to rule the galaxy, before their own excesses led them to the greatest catastrophe the galaxy had ever seen. The origins of the Eldar stretch back to the earliest days of the galaxy's recorded history, long before humanity even had fire, let alone dreams of empire. To truly understand their rise to power, we have to go back to the War in Heaven, a conflict so ancient that it has been reduced to little more than myth, even among the most learned scholars of the 41st millennium. But for the Eldar, this war was the foundation of everything, their power, their supremacy, and ultimately their downfall. The galaxy was not always as chaotic and war-torn as it is today. In its earliest ages, it was ruled by beings so powerful and mysterious that their very existence still sparks endless debate. The Old Ones, as they are now known, were an ancient race of godlike entities, the first great civilization to arise in the cosmos. They were masters of the warp, wielding it not as a dangerous, unpredictable force, but as a tool, a weapon, and a means to shape reality itself. The Eldar, it is said, were one of their greatest creations, perhaps even their final one. Why the Old Ones created the Eldar is a question that has no definitive answer, but the most widely accepted theory is that they were a weapon, an answer to the terrifying threat posed by the Necrons and their Satan overlords. The Necrons were unlike any foe the Old Ones had ever faced, soulless, relentless, and wielding technology that allowed them to strip stars bare and render entire civilizations extinct in a matter of days. The Old Ones, despite their immense power, could not defeat them alone. So they did what they had always done. They created warriors to fight their battles. The Eldari were born not as simple soldiers, but as a race inherently attuned to the warp, gifted with psychic abilities beyond anything the Necrons could hope to match. They were not only powerful, but intelligent, fast, and impossibly graceful. Unlike the Necrons, who relied on cold logic and relentless efficiency, the Eldari possessed creativity, instinct, and an unrivaled ability to adapt. They were, for lack of a better term, perfect. And for a time, it seemed that they might actually turn the tide of the war. But the war in heaven was not a simple conflict of armies clashing on the battlefield. It was a struggle between fundamental forces, the material and the immaterial, the cold precision of the Necrons and the raw, unrestrained energy of the warp. In their desperation, the Old Ones pushed the boundaries of creation, shaping new forms of life, new psychic entities, and ultimately sealing their own doom. For while the Necrons could be fought with flesh and blood warriors, the chaos they unleashed in the warp was something else entirely. The war ended in catastrophe. The Necrons, realizing they could not win through sheer force alone, turned on their own masters, shattering the C'tan and breaking their chains. The Old Ones, weakened and stretched too thin, simply vanished, their empire crumbling into dust. Some say they were wiped out entirely. Others believe they still exist, lurking in the shadows of the webway, or hidden in some distant part of the galaxy. But whatever the truth, their greatest creation, the Eldari, were left behind. And with the Old Ones gone, they inherited the ruins of a war-torn galaxy. This is where the Eldari truly began to rise. Unlike the Necrons, who sealed themselves away in their tomb worlds to wait for the galaxy to recover, the Eldari saw the power vacuum left behind and filled it with terrifying efficiency. Their civilization spread across the stars, growing beyond even what the Old Ones had accomplished. Without rivals to challenge them, they became the unquestioned rulers of the galaxy. Their psychic potential allowed them to manipulate reality itself, and their connection to the webway made them all but untouchable. It is fascinating to consider what the galaxy might have looked like if things had played out differently. If the Old Ones had survived, would the Eldari have remained their loyal servants, or would they have rebelled against their creators, as so many other species have done? Some theories suggest that the Eldari might have even played a role in the Old Ones' downfall, turning on them once they no longer needed their guidance. It is impossible to know for sure, but what is certain is that by the time the war in heaven ended, the Eldari were the last true superpower left standing. But power without opposition is a dangerous thing. The Eldari had been bred for war, designed to combat an enemy that no longer existed. With no external threats to unite them, they turned inward, refining their culture, their technology, and their mastery over the warp. For millennia, they shaped the galaxy to their liking, creating paradise worlds and living in a state of perfection that no other race could even comprehend. It was, in many ways, a golden age unlike any other. Yet, even at the height of their power, there were whispers of something lurking beneath the surface. The Eldari had been shaped by war, and without it, they had no true purpose. Some believed that the peace they had created was unnatural, that it could not last. And they were right, because the seeds of their destruction had already been planted, hidden beneath the beauty of their empire, waiting for the right moment to emerge. For now, though, they stood supreme, their dominion uncontested. The galaxy belonged to the Eldari, and they believed it always would. To speak of the golden age of the Eldari is to speak of a civilization that existed at a level of perfection that no other species has ever achieved. Even the Imperium of Man at its peak during the Great Crusade, with all its technological marvels and sheer dominance, was nothing compared to the Eldar Empire at the height of its power. This was not merely a civilization that thrived. It was a civilization that had mastered existence itself. Imagine a galaxy where war was no longer a necessity. The Eldari had no need to conquer, for they had already claimed everything worth having. They did not struggle for survival, for their knowledge of medicine, genetics, and psychic healing had made disease and frailty all but irrelevant. Hunger, poverty, and suffering were concepts that had been left behind long ago. Their worlds, vast, sculpted paradise planets, were places where nature itself bent to their desires. Oceans shimmered in unnatural hues, forests breathed in harmony with their inhabitants, and great cities woven from the living psychoreactive material known as wraithbone pulsed with energy, responding to the thoughts and emotions of those who dwelled within them. Technology was not something they built. It was something they willed into existence. Where humanity requires factories, resources, and labor, the Eldari shaped their tools with thought alone, their psychic abilities seamlessly integrated into every aspect of their lives. They could create weapons of war that could disassemble a target at the molecular level, yet they rarely had to use them. Their starships glided through real space and the webway alike, navigating the galaxy without the crude and dangerous reliance on the warp that the Imperium would one day come to fear. But more than anything, what made the Eldari unique, what truly set them apart, was their innate psychic nature. Every single Eldari was born a psyker, their minds so powerful that even the weakest among them possessed abilities that would make a human psyker look like a child fumbling with a candle in the face of a supernova. Their connection to the Immaterium was natural, effortless. They did not fear demonic corruption, nor did they require the draconian restrictions and safeguards that human psykers must endure. The warp was, at this time, calm, undisturbed by the horrors that would one day make it the nightmare realm of chaos. The Eldari could use it as a tool, tapping into its raw energy to power their technology, enhance their bodies, and extend their lives beyond anything mortals could dream of. This is something that often gets overlooked when discussing their empire. It wasn't just that they had better technology, or that they were smarter and faster than other species. It was that they existed on a level of consciousness that no one else could match. They could see the flow of fate, navigate through possible futures, and make choices based on knowledge that others simply did not have access to. It is no exaggeration to say that they could bend reality itself, and they did so not through machinery or science, but through sheer will. Culturally, the Eldari were as refined as they were advanced. Every form of art, music, and performance was pushed to an extreme level of perfection. Their artists did not simply paint, they wove emotion and memory into their works, creating pieces that could make the viewer experience entire lifetimes in an instant. Their music was not merely sound. It was a psychic expression, a tapestry of thought and sensation that could evoke pure ecstasy or crushing sorrow at the whim of the performer. Even their most casual expressions of creativity were leagues beyond what other species could comprehend. And yet, for all their brilliance, there was something else beneath it all. A slow, creeping decadence. When you have mastered everything, when there are no struggles left, what is there to reach for? The Eldari had built a utopia, but in doing so, they had removed all hardship, all challenge, all sense of purpose. There was nothing left for them to strive against, no great trials to overcome. And so, they turned inward. Some argue that the seeds of their downfall were planted the moment they no longer had worthy enemies to face. Without struggle, without the need to fight for survival, they began to seek fulfillment elsewhere. And as we know now, that search would lead them to something far darker than they could have ever imagined. But in this golden age, such concerns were distant, nothing more than the paranoid ramblings of those too cautious to embrace the gifts of their civilization. The Eldari saw themselves as eternal, untouchable. They had ascended beyond the need for war, beyond the primitive concerns of lesser races. To them, the galaxy was theirs, and it always would be. They could not have been more wrong. The Eldari had reached a level of perfection that no other race could even dream of, and yet perfection proved to be the very thing that would destroy them. When you have everything, when you have no obstacles, no struggles, and no fears. What is left? The Eldari, for all their brilliance, were not immune to this question. And so, in the absence of purpose, they sought fulfillment in the one thing that was still unknown to them, pleasure in its purest, rawest form. At first, it was harmless. Their civilization was one of art, beauty, and self-expression, so it was only natural that they would explore the depths of sensation in ways no other species could. Music, dance, and poetry became more than just forms of entertainment. They became experiences that could transport the mind to places beyond mortal comprehension. Emotions were no longer just felt, but sculpted, refined, and shared. Their psychic gifts allowed them to experience the world in ways unimaginable to lesser beings, and they used those gifts to push the boundaries of what pleasure could be. But when you remove all limits, when there is nothing standing between you and your every desire, excess becomes inevitable. What begins as refinement soon turns into indulgence. What begins as curiosity quickly spirals into obsession. And for the Eldari, a race whose every experience was heightened beyond anything humans could comprehend, the descent was rapid and absolute. The simple pleasures of art and culture no longer satisfied them. They had tasted the extremes of beauty, so they sought the extremes of sensation itself. Pleasure cults began to form, each more decadent than the last. At first, these were secretive gatherings, small groups of like-minded individuals seeking to push themselves beyond the limits of ordinary experience. But as the centuries passed, these cults grew in influence, drawing more and more Eldari into their grasp. And with no true government to stop them, no external force to regulate their behavior, nothing stood in their way. Entire cities transformed into dens of excess. Pain and pleasure became indistinguishable as the Eldari experimented with sensations so intense that they blurred the line between ecstasy and suffering. Some cults sought enlightenment through sensory overload, consuming the most potent substances and engaging in rituals that shattered their perception of reality. Others found joy in cruelty, their psychic gifts allowing them to amplify and share the suffering of others in ways too horrific to describe. What mattered was the experience, the chase for something new, something more. And as their pursuits became darker, they became oblivious to the shadow they were casting into the warp. There are many theories about why the Eldari failed to recognize the danger they were in. Some believe they were simply too arrogant, convinced of their own supremacy, and unable to imagine that their actions could have consequences. Others think they did sense something was wrong, but by the time they realized the full scope of the problem, it was already too late. Perhaps the most chilling possibility is that they knew what they were doing, that they could feel the growing presence in the warp, but they simply didn't care. The promise of sensation, of something greater, was too intoxicating. Not all Eldari were blind to the danger. There were those who saw what was happening and recoiled in horror. The Exodites were the first to leave, abandoning their homeworlds to settle on distant, untouched planets, seeking a simpler existence. They saw what their kind was becoming and wanted no part of it. The Asuryani, the future craft world Eldar, would follow soon after, retreating into massive starships, carrying with them the last remnants of what they believed was a purer way of life. But the majority remained, caught in the ever-escalating spiral of indulgence, completely unaware, or simply uncaring, that they were rushing toward their own doom. Looking back, it is almost surreal to think that a race as powerful, as intelligent, and as gifted as the Eldari could let themselves fall so far. It was not an external force that brought them down. It was not war, nor invasion, nor betrayal. It was their own desires, their own unchecked hunger for more. They had conquered the stars, but they could not conquer themselves. The fall was coming, and when it arrived, it would not be a slow decline. It would be an explosion, sudden, catastrophic, and irreversible. But in these final days before their reckoning, the Eldari did not see it. They only saw the next thrill, the next experience, the next step into the abyss. There is something uniquely terrifying about the birth of Slaanesh, something that sets it apart from the creation of the other Chaos gods. Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle all emerged gradually, feeding on the raw emotions of countless species over millions of years. But Slaanesh? Slaanesh was crafted, not by accident, not by war or by suffering, but by pure indulgence. It was the ultimate catastrophic consequence of the Aeldari's unchecked decadence, a god formed entirely from their own excess. And the worst part, they made it. Imagine an entire race, the most powerful psychers in existence, pouring their emotions into the warp every single day for millennia. The Aeldari were already deeply connected to the Immaterium, far more so than humans or any other species. Every thought, every desire, every act of indulgence left an imprint in the warp, shaping it. The warp is not just a realm of energy, it is a reflection of the emotions that pour into it. And the Aeldari, in their relentless pursuit of pleasure, had been feeding something in the darkness. Something that was waiting, something that was growing. There are theories about when exactly Slaanesh became self-aware. Some believe the god had been forming for thousands of years, slowly building power as the pleasure cults of the Aeldari became more extreme. Others argue that Slaanesh was born in an instant, a psychic detonation so powerful that it sent shockwaves through reality itself. What is certain is that when She Who Thirsts finally awoke, it was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Aeldari across the stars felt their souls ripped from their bodies, drawn into the newborn god's grasp. Entire planets were left as lifeless husks, their populations simply gone. The heart of the Eldar Empire, a region that had once been the pinnacle of civilization, was consumed by a warp rift so massive that it still scars the galaxy today, the Eye of Terror. What makes this even more tragic is that it was entirely avoidable. The Eldari were not ignorant. They knew the warp. They had studied it, shaped it, used it as a tool for millennia. They should have seen the signs. And yet, for all their wisdom, they allowed this to happen. Why? Some say it was arrogance, an unwillingness to believe that their own actions could have consequences. Others argue that they were simply too lost in their hedonism to care. And then there's the most haunting theory of all, that they did realize what was happening, but by the time they saw the danger, they were already too deep. Could they have stopped it? That's a debate that has raged among fans and lore theorists for years. Some believe that if the Eldari had recognized the warning signs earlier, if they had reined in their excesses and reintroduced some kind of structure to their society, they might have avoided disaster. The Exodites and Craftworld Eldari proved that self-discipline was possible. Perhaps if the majority of their race had followed those examples, they could have cut off Slaanesh's power before the god fully formed. But there's a counter-argument, one that suggests their doom was inevitable. The Eldari were too psychic, too powerful, too deeply connected to the warp. Even if they had tried to control themselves, their emotions would have still flowed into the Immaterium. They could not stop being who they were, and who they were, creatures of intense passion, creativity, and indulgence, was precisely what made Slaanesh possible. Maybe, just maybe, the moment the Old Ones created them, their fate was already sealed. Regardless of the what-ifs, the reality is that Slaanesh was born, and with that birth, the Eldari lost everything. Their greatest achievement, the empire that had ruled the stars for uncounted millennia, was undone in a single moment. The echoes of their excess still linger in the galaxy, a grim warning of what happens when a civilization forgets balance, when it believes itself untouchable. The irony is almost poetic. The Eldari sought ultimate pleasure, ultimate experience, and in doing so, they created the ultimate predator, one that would hunt them until the end of time. There are few moments in the history of the galaxy as apocalyptic as the birth of Slaanesh. It wasn't just the fall of a civilization. It was the death of an entire era, a psychic detonation so powerful that it tore reality apart. The Eldari had built a paradise, a utopia of perfect worlds, bound together by the webway and ruled by a race that had long considered themselves gods among mortals. And in a single moment, it was all gone. The birth cry of Slaanesh was not a sound, but a psychic scream that shattered the very fabric of existence. Every Eldari within thousands of light years felt it, a pulling sensation in their souls as their life force was ripped from their bodies. The most horrifying part? Many of them had no idea what was happening. One moment, they were lost in their endless pleasures, indulging in the extremes of sensation, and the next, silence. No time to run, no chance to fight. Just the sudden, all-consuming presence of something vast, hungry, and inescapable. Billions died instantly. Their bodies remained untouched and lifeless, but their souls were devoured, swallowed by the entity they had unknowingly created. Entire planets, once brimming with life, culture, and impossible beauty, became graveyards in an instant. The heart of the Eldar Empire, once the crown jewel of the galaxy, was reduced to a wasteland of husks and shadows. And at the center of it all, where the dens of hedonism had reached their peak, the fabric of reality itself gave way. The Eye of Terror was not just a warp rift. It was a scar upon the universe, a wound left by the sheer force of Slaanesh's awakening. It was as if real space itself had recoiled, unable to contain the horror of what had just occurred. The warp did not merely leak through, it erupted, consuming entire systems, twisting planets into realms of nightmare, and trapping the souls of the fallen in an endless cycle of torment. Those Eldari who died in that moment did not merely cease to exist. They became playthings for she who thirsts, forever reliving their final moments in an eternity of suffering. Even those who had fled, the Asuriani aboard their craft worlds, the Exodites on their distant maiden worlds, were not spared the psychic shockwave. The echoes of their dying kin tore through the galaxy like a storm, and many who had believed themselves safe collapsed as their spirits were ripped from their bodies. The craft worlds that had managed to escape only survived because of sheer distance, and even then some were lost, dragged into the warp as the chaos of the fall spread outward. The physical devastation was almost as horrifying as the psychic one. The Eye of Terror was not a static phenomenon. It was an ever-shifting storm, a place where time and space bent in ways that defied logic. Planets that had once been paradises became nightmare realms, home to demonic entities that thrived on the raw energy of the warp. Ancient cities, once the epitome of Eldari perfection, became ruins haunted by creatures too twisted to describe. The once pristine star lanes of the Eldar Empire were swallowed whole, replaced by the madness of the Immaterium. And beyond the eye, the ripple effects continued. The warp storms that had once isolated Terra and cut off humanity's fledgling empire for thousands of years suddenly ceased. The age of strife, which had kept humanity fractured and vulnerable, ended in an instant. With the chaos in the warp momentarily stabilized by Slaanesh's birth, the Emperor of Mankind was finally able to begin his great crusade. The irony was inescapable. The death of the Eldar Empire was the catalyst for the rise of the Imperium of Man. There are endless debates about whether the Eldari could have saved themselves. Some believe that if they had recognized the warning signs sooner, they could have prepared, erected psychic defenses, or found a way to suppress the nascent god within the warp. Others argue that the doom of their race was inevitable, that their very nature made Slaanesh's birth unavoidable. Perhaps the most tragic theory of all is that they were doomed the moment they became dominant. Power without struggle breeds complacency, and the Eldari had grown so powerful, so untouchable, that they simply did not believe they could fall, but fall they did. And unlike so many other civilizations that had faded slowly, eroded by time or war, the Eldari collapsed in an instant, their entire empire undone by their own hands. The sheer speed and finality of their destruction is what makes the fall of the Eldari one of the most chilling tragedies in all of Warhammer 40k. It was not a war. It was not a conquest. It was annihilation, swift and merciless. The Eldari who remained would never be the same. They would be haunted by the knowledge of what they had done, by the echoes of the souls that had been lost. And worse, they would forever be hunted. Slaanesh did not merely consume the Eldari. She claimed them. Every Eldari born after the fall carries within them a soul that she who thirsts will claim upon their death unless they find a way to prevent it. There is no escaping what they created, no undoing the past. This was not just the end of an empire, it was the beginning of an eternity of suffering. There are few moments in the history of the galaxy as apocalyptic as the birth of Slaanesh. It wasn't just the fall of a civilization, it was the death of an entire era, a psychic detonation so powerful that it tore reality apart. The Eldari had built a paradise, a utopia of perfect worlds, bound together by the webway and ruled by a race that had long considered themselves gods among mortals. And in a single moment, it was all gone. The birth cry of Slaanesh was not a sound, but a psychic scream that shattered the very fabric of existence. Every Eldari within thousands of light years felt it, a pulling sensation in their souls as their life force was ripped from their bodies. The most horrifying part? Many of them had no idea what was happening. One moment, they were lost in their endless pleasures, indulging in the extremes of sensation, and the next, silence. No time to run, no chance to fight. Just the sudden, all-consuming presence of something vast, hungry, and inescapable. Billions died instantly. Their bodies remained untouched and lifeless, but their souls were devoured, swallowed by the entity they had unknowingly created. Entire planets, once brimming with life, culture, and impossible beauty, became graveyards in an instant. The heart of the Eldar Empire, once the crown jewel of the galaxy, was reduced to a wasteland of husks and shadows. And at the center of it all, where the dens of hedonism had reached their peak, the fabric of reality itself gave way. The Eye of Terror was not just a warp rift. It was a scar upon the universe, a wound left by the sheer force of Slaanesh's awakening. It was as if real space itself had recoiled, unable to contain the horror of what had just occurred. The warp did not merely leak through. It erupted, consuming entire systems, twisting planets into realms of nightmare and trapping the souls of the fallen in an endless cycle of torment. Those Eldari who died in that moment did not merely cease to exist. They became playthings for she who thirsts, forever reliving their final moments in an eternity of suffering. Even those who had fled, the Asuryani aboard their craft worlds, the Exodites on their distant maiden worlds, were not spared the psychic shockwave. The echoes of their dying kin tore through the galaxy like a storm, and many who had believed themselves safe collapsed as their spirits were ripped from their bodies. The craft worlds that had managed to escape only survived because of sheer distance, and even then, some were lost, dragged into the warp as the chaos of the fall spread outward. The physical devastation was almost as horrifying as the psychic one. The Eye of Terror was not a static phenomenon. It was an ever-shifting storm, a place where time and space bent in ways that defied logic. Planets that had once been paradises became nightmare realms, home to demonic entities that thrived on the raw energy of the warp. Ancient cities, once the epitome of Eldari perfection, became ruins haunted by creatures too twisted to describe. The once pristine star lanes of the Eldar Empire were swallowed whole, replaced by the madness of the Immaterium. And beyond the Eye, the ripple effects continued. The warp storms that had once isolated Terra and cut off humanity's fledgling empire for thousands of years suddenly ceased. The age of strife, which had kept humanity fractured and vulnerable, ended in an instant. With the chaos in the warp momentarily stabilized by Slaanesh's birth, the Emperor of Mankind was finally able to begin his great crusade. The irony was inescapable. The death of the Eldar Empire was the catalyst for the rise of the Imperium of Man. There are endless debates about whether the Eldari could have saved themselves. Some believe that if they had recognized the warning signs sooner, they could have prepared, erected psychic defenses, or found a way to suppress the nascent god within the warp. Others argue that the doom of their race was inevitable, that their very nature made Slaanesh's birth unavoidable. Perhaps the most tragic theory of all is that they were doomed the moment they became dominant. Power without struggle breeds complacency, and the Eldari had grown so powerful, so untouchable, that they simply did not believe they could fall. But fall they did. And unlike so many other civilizations that had faded slowly, eroded by time or war, the Eldari collapsed in an instant, their entire empire undone by their own hands. The sheer speed and finality of their destruction is what makes the fall of the Eldari one of the most chilling tragedies in all of Warhammer 40k. It was not a war, it was not a conquest, it was annihilation, swift and merciless. The Eldari who remained would never be the same. They would be haunted by the knowledge of what they had done, by the echoes of the souls that had been lost. And worse, they would forever be hunted. Slaanesh did not merely consume the Eldari, she claimed them. Every Eldari born after the fall carries within them a soul that she who thirsts will claim upon their death unless they find a way to prevent it. There is no escaping what they created, no undoing the past. This was not just the end of an empire. It was the beginning of an eternity of suffering. The fall of the Eldari wasn't just the death of a civilization. It was the birth of something entirely new, or rather, the shattered remnants of what once was. With their empire in ruins and the souls of their kin consumed by the god they had unwittingly created, the survivors were left with a singular, terrifying realization. There was no going back. The old ways had led to destruction, and those who remained had only two choices: find a way to survive or be devoured like the rest. This is the moment where the Eldari people truly fractured. Before the fall, they had been one people, united in their arrogance, their power, and their belief in their own supremacy. Now, they were scattered, broken, and haunted by the ghost of their own sins. Different groups arose, each with their own means of survival, their own philosophy on what it meant to be Eldari in a galaxy that had turned against them. And while they might share a common ancestry, the differences between them would become so stark that in time they would barely recognize each other as kin. The most well-known among them, and arguably the closest to the Eldari of old, are the Asuryani, or Craftworld Eldari. They were the ones who had seen the writing on the wall before it was too late, those who had chosen to flee before the final collapse. They escaped aboard massive world ships known as Craftworlds, city-sized vessels that became both home and fortress, drifting through the void as self-sustaining remnants of their former glory. But they didn't just flee, they changed. The Asuryani knew that they could never allow themselves to fall into the same excess that had doomed their ancestors. And so, they created the Path System, an elaborate structure of discipline and control that would prevent their people from ever descending into hedonism again. Every Asuryani follows a path, be it the path of the warrior, the seer, the artisan, each one dictating their role in society, their purpose, and their emotional boundaries. It is a rigid existence, but they accept it because they know the alternative. For the Asuryani, there is no greater fear than becoming what their ancestors were. But while the Asuryani chose order and control, there were others who embraced the chaos. The Drukhari, or Dark Eldar, did not flee into the depths of space. Instead, they fled into the webway, hiding away in the ancient city of Kamara, a place that had existed even before the fall as a den of the most depraved among their kind. Unlike the Asuryani, the Drukhari did not seek to change. If anything, they leaned further into their old ways, becoming something even worse than the pleasure seekers who had birthed Slaanesh. Because unlike the Craftworld Eldari, who had found a way to protect their souls through spirit stones, the Drukhari had no such safeguards. They were fully exposed to She Who Thirsts, and the only way they could stave off the slow death of their souls was through suffering, not their own, but that of others. So they became raiders, slavers, and torturers, descending upon the galaxy like a plague, harvesting pain and agony as if it were a form of sustenance. To them, the galaxy is nothing but a hunting ground, and every living being is a resource to be drained. They are a nightmare made flesh, a civilization that should have died with the fall, but instead found a way to thrive in the most twisted way possible. Then there were the Exodites. Unlike the Asuryani or the Drukhari, these were the Eldari who had left before the fall even happened. They had seen what was coming long before the first whispers of Slaanesh, recognizing the growing corruption in their people and rejecting it entirely. They abandoned their decadent cities, their vast wealth, and the comforts of their technology, choosing instead to live simple, hard lives on distant maiden worlds. They are, in many ways, the most primitive of the Eldari, but that is by design. They see hardship as a form of salvation, a way to purge themselves of the weaknesses that had led to their people's doom. They live in harmony with their worlds, working the land and riding massive reptilian beasts into battle. But make no mistake, they are not a peaceful people. When threatened, they fight with the same grace and lethality as their spacefaring kin, but they do so with an unwavering conviction that their way is the only true path to redemption. And then there are the Harlequins. If the Asuryani are the last remnants of the old empire, and the Drukhari are its most twisted echoes, then the Harlequins are something else entirely. They do not belong to any one faction, nor do they follow the same rules as the others. Instead, they serve the laughing god, Sigarak, and they alone seem to have a purpose beyond mere survival. They are both performers and warriors, traveling the webway, visiting craft worlds, Exodite worlds, even Kamara itself. Their role? To ensure that the memory of what happened is never forgotten. They perform the great tragedies of their people, retelling the fall in a way that ensures no Eldari ever forgets their greatest sin. And in battle, they are terrifying, moving with a speed and fluidity that seems almost supernatural, cutting down foes before they even realize they are under attack. Some believe that the Harlequins have a plan, a grand scheme that only they understand, one that could perhaps one day undo the damage that was done. But if they do, they aren't telling. And finally, there are the Inari, the newest and perhaps most controversial faction among the Eldari. They are the followers of Ynnead, the Eldari god of the dead, a being that some believe has the power to finally destroy Slaanesh once and for all. The Inari believe that by embracing death, by willingly surrendering their souls to Ynnead, instead of being consumed by She Who Thirsts, they can break the curse that has haunted their people for 10,000 years. Led by Yvraine, a former Drukhari who has become the prophet of this new faith, they seek to unite all Eldari under a single cause, the final destruction of Slaanesh. But not all Eldari trust them. The Asuryani fear that the Inari's methods could bring more harm than good. The Drukhari see them as a threat to their way of life, and even the Harlequins remain wary of what this new movement truly represents. Are they the saviors of their race, or just another doomed experiment in the long, tragic history of the Eldari? The fragmentation of the Eldari is one of the great tragedies of the setting. Once they were a single, united force, the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known. Now, they are divided, each clinging to their own form of survival, each distrusting the others, even as the enemies of their people close in from all sides. Could they ever reunite? Could they ever become what they once were? Or are they doomed to remain scattered, fighting their separate battles until the last of them finally fades into oblivion? If there's one thing the Eldari have taught us, it's that even the most powerful can fall. And once that fall begins, there may be no climbing back up. The 41st millennium is an age of decay, war, and endless suffering. For the Eldari, it is a living nightmare, a cruel reminder of all they have lost, and the impossibility of reclaiming it. The galaxy has moved on without them, and where they once ruled as its masters, they are now little more than ghosts, scattered remnants of a civilization that once eclipsed all others. Every day is a struggle for survival, not just against the enemies that would see them wiped from existence, but against the shadow of she who thirsts, the ever-hungry maw of Slaanesh that waits to claim them the moment they falter. For the Asuryani, survival means discipline. Their craft worlds drift through the void, ancient and majestic, but dwindling in number. Each one is a self-contained world, a floating ark carrying the last vestiges of their people's culture and knowledge. But these are not the thriving cities they once were. They are dying. Every battle costs them dearly, and every loss is irreplaceable. Their population dwindles with each passing century, and the burden of maintaining their way of life grows heavier. To them, the path system is not just a philosophy, it is a necessity. Without it, they risk slipping into the same self-destructive excess that led to their doom. Their warriors, the Aspect Shrines, train in the ways of war with an intensity that borders on religious devotion, knowing that every battle they fight may be their last. Their seers, their farseers and warlocks, navigate the tangled web of fate, seeking any possible path that might lead to their survival. But the future is bleak, and with every year, those paths grow fewer. The Drukhari, in contrast, do not fight for survival in the traditional sense. They have already accepted that their existence is a cruel and predatory one, and they have built their entire way of life around that reality. They do not seek to preserve their race in the way the Asuryani do. They seek only to prolong their own individual existence, and they do so at the expense of all others. Komorra remains a festering wound in the webway, a place of unthinkable horror and depravity, yet it thrives in its own way. While the rest of the Eldari diminish, the Drukhari have adapted, finding a way to stave off their inevitable doom through pain and suffering. They are predators, raiders, and torturers, descending upon the lesser races to harvest agony as if it were currency. And yet, for all their cruelty, they too live in fear. The moment they stop, the moment they show weakness, Slaanesh will take them. The unending cycle of torment is not just a pastime. It is their lifeline, their only way to stay ahead of the doom that looms over them. The Exodites, by contrast, live in self-imposed exile on their maiden worlds, far removed from the grand conflicts that define the rest of the galaxy. They have adapted by rejecting their past, by choosing hardship and simplicity over decadence and power. While the Asuryani struggle to maintain their dying civilization and the Drukhari wallow in their cruelty, the Exodites have, in some ways, found the closest thing to peace that any Eldari can hope for. But peace does not mean safety. Their worlds are constantly under threat, whether from encroaching humans, marauding orcs, or the ever-present dangers of the galaxy's many horrors. They fight as fiercely as any other Eldari when their homes are threatened, but they do so with a determination that is almost tragic. They do not fight for conquest or power. They fight simply to hold on to what little they have left. The Harlequins, as always, remain an enigma. They do not fight for survival in the way the others do, for they do not see themselves as a doomed people. To them, the story of the Eldari is still being written, and they are its performers, its keepers. They travel where they please, slipping between craft worlds, Exodite colonies, and even Komorra itself, untouched by the divisions that have fractured their kin. Some say they have a plan, that Segorak, the Laughing God, has foreseen a way to escape the fate that has claimed so many. Others believe that they are merely playing out their part in a cosmic tragedy, that they know the end is inevitable, but refuse to let it be forgotten. Whatever the truth may be, they are the one force among the Eldari that still seems to act with purpose, even if no one truly understands what that purpose is. And then there are the Inari, the newest and perhaps most controversial force to emerge from the ashes of the Eldari's downfall. They believe that there is still hope, that their race can be saved, not through survival, but through death. The followers of Ynnead, the nascent god of the dead, believe that only by embracing death can they finally rid themselves of Slaanesh's curse. They seek to unite the Eldari under a single banner, to bring about a final war that will see their race either destroyed or reborn. To some, they are saviors, the last hope of a dying people. To others, they are a reckless cult, a desperate gamble that will only hasten the end. The Asuryani distrust them, the Drukhari despise them, and even the Harlequins seem unsure of what to make of them. But they are growing, and with each soul they claim for Ynnead, their power increases. Whether that power will be enough to change the fate of their people remains to be seen. Survival for the Eldari is not just a matter of endurance. It is a question of identity. What does it mean to be Eldari in a galaxy that has long since moved on? The humans, the orcs, the Necrons, the Tyranids, all of them see the Eldari as just another faction in the endless war for supremacy. None of them truly understand that they are dealing with the remnants of something far greater than themselves, the last echoes of an empire that once ruled the stars. And yet, for all their history, for all their knowledge and power, the Eldari are caught in an impossible struggle. They are a race of ghosts, trapped between past and future, unable to fully let go of what they once were, but incapable of reclaiming it. Could they rise again? Could they ever be more than just remnants? There are those who believe that the Eldari are destined to fade into obscurity, that their time has passed, and their only future is one of slow decline. But there are others who see a different possibility. Perhaps the Eldari are not a dying race, but a race in transition. Perhaps they are not meant to reclaim their old empire, but to become something new, something different. The Inari believe this, as do some among the Harlequins. Even among the Asuryani, there are whispers that change may yet come, that the fate of their people is not yet sealed. The struggle for survival is not just about avoiding extinction, it is about finding purpose. And in the endless darkness of the 41st millennium, purpose is the one thing the Eldari cannot afford to lose. The idea of the Eldari reclaiming their former glory is one of the most hotly debated topics among fans of Warhammer 40k. Some believe that their fall was too absolute, that they are too few, too divided, and too consumed by their own flaws to ever return to dominance. Others, however, see potential, a sliver of hope buried beneath millennia of suffering. The question is, what would it even mean for the Eldari to rise again? Would it be a return to the decadent, galaxy-spanning empire of old, or would it be something new entirely? At first glance, the odds seem overwhelmingly against them. Their population is in terminal decline. The craft worlds, though powerful, are isolated and dwindling in number. The Drukhari, for all their cruelty and resourcefulness, are locked in a cycle of self-destruction that can only end in disaster. The Exodites are too few, too reclusive, and too committed to their chosen way of life to ever lead a grand resurgence. Even the Harlequins, mysterious and enigmatic as they are, do not seem interested in restoring their people's former dominion. And all of them, no matter their differences, remain bound to the shadow of Slaanesh. She who thirsts is always watching, always waiting, a constant reminder that even the most powerful among them cannot escape their doom. And yet, despite all of this, the Eldari still endure. They have survived horrors that would have annihilated any lesser species. They have faced extinction time and time again, and still found a way to persist. This is where the debate truly begins. Are they merely delaying the inevitable, or is there still a future where they reclaim what was lost? Some point to the Inari as the first real sign of change in millennia. The followers of Ynnead, the nascent god of the dead, believe that the only way to free their people from Slaanesh's grasp is to embrace death, not as an end, but as a transformation. Their leader, Yvrain, speaks of a future where the Eldari are no longer divided, where they are reborn as something stronger. The idea is compelling, even poetic. If Slaanesh was born from their excess and corruption, perhaps a god of death could undo that sin. The Inari have already demonstrated strange and terrifying powers, their warriors capable of defying death itself. Some believe that if their numbers grow, if more Eldari embrace this path, they might one day have the strength to challenge Slaanesh directly. But even among the Eldari, the Inari are controversial. Many see them as a reckless gamble, a cult that will only hasten their people's demise. The Asuryani are deeply divided on the matter. Some believe Yvraine offers salvation, while others see her as a dangerous radical who risks everything they have fought to preserve. The Drukhari, unsurprisingly, despise the Inari. The idea of embracing death, even in a spiritual sense, is anathema to them. Kamara is built on the idea of survival at any cost, and the rise of the Inari has thrown the Dark City into chaos. Some have embraced their cause, but others see them as an existential threat. Vecht himself has made it clear that Yvraine is an enemy, and if he sees her as a threat, that alone is a testament to the movement's potential. The Harlequins, always the wild card, seem to support the Inari's efforts, or at least tolerate them. This is significant, as the servants of Segarak do not act without purpose. If they are guiding Yvraine's rise, it suggests that they believe the Eldari still have a role to play in the galaxy's future. But what that role is, and whether it will lead to salvation or destruction, remains uncertain. Beyond the Inari, there are other, more pragmatic arguments for an Eldari resurgence. The galaxy is in a state of unprecedented upheaval. The Imperium is fractured, its very foundation shaken by the return of Guilliman and the emergence of the Great Rift. The Necrons are awakening, but even they are not the unified empire they once were. The Tyranids, for all their terrifying power, are still an external force, one that can be fought and perhaps manipulated. Chaos, though ever present, is as much a danger to itself as to others. If there were ever a time for the Eldari to carve out a new future, it is now. But what would that future look like? The Eldari of old were masters of the galaxy, but they ruled through arrogance, believing themselves untouchable. That arrogance led to their doom. If they are to rise again, they cannot make the same mistakes. This is perhaps the greatest challenge they face, not just survival, but transformation. Can they let go of their past, their old ways, and become something new? Or are they doomed to repeat history, to climb back to power only to fall once more? Some believe that the Eldari's best chance lies not in reclaiming their empire, but in forging a new one built not on domination, but on unity. The Inari represent one possibility, but there are others. Some whisper of alliances, of a future where the Eldari work with humanity rather than against it. This is almost unthinkable to most. After all, the Eldari see humans as little more than crude, short-lived barbarians. But desperation breeds strange alliances. There are already hints of cooperation in some places, alliances of necessity, brief moments where Eldari and humans have fought side by side. Could this be the seed of something greater? And then there are those who believe that salvation lies not in the material world, but in the webway. The Eldari once ruled the stars, but their greatest secret was always the hidden pathways that allowed them to move unseen. Some believe that the future of their people does not lie in reclaiming the galaxy, but in withdrawing from it entirely, retreating into the depths of the webway to rebuild, to create a new civilization beyond the reach of lesser species. Kamara has already proven that such a thing is possible, but could the Eldari as a whole embrace such a path? Would it be survival, or merely another form of stagnation? Ultimately, there are no easy answers. The Eldari are at a crossroads, and the choices they make in the coming centuries will determine whether they have a future at all. Some believe that their time is truly over, that they will fade into legend, their once great empire reduced to nothing more than myth. Others see a glimmer of hope, a possibility that they might yet rise again. But if they do, it will not be as the Eldari of old. It will be as something new, something reborn from the ashes of their past. And perhaps that is the true nature of their fate, not to reclaim their former glory, but to become something greater. The Eldari's place in the galaxy is a paradox. They are both ancient and fading, powerful and fragile, unmatched in knowledge, yet crippled by their own dwindling numbers. Once, they were the dominant force in the galaxy, but now they must maneuver through a chaotic and violent universe, one where every major faction either seeks to destroy them or barely acknowledges their continued existence. Despite all of this, they endure. But the question remains, how long can they survive, and do they have a future beyond mere survival? Their relationship with the Imperium of Man is, at best, complicated. To the average Imperial citizen, the Eldari are nothing more than Xeno scum, another abomination to be purged in the Emperor's name. To the Inquisition, especially the Ordo Xenos, they are an ever-present threat, a relic of an era best left forgotten. The Imperium's brutality and dogma make meaningful cooperation almost impossible. However, at times, necessity forces the two to work together. The Eldari have, on multiple occasions, aided the Imperium in battles against Chaos and the Tyranids, but these alliances are always temporary, always fragile. The Eldari do not trust humanity, and the Imperium certainly does not trust them. Guilliman, in his newfound pragmatism, might be more willing to acknowledge the Eldari's role in galactic affairs, but even he is bound by the Imperium's xenophobic nature. The irony is that the Eldari see humans as little more than children playing with fire. They view humanity's expansion across the stars with a mix of disdain and horror. Where the Eldari were once the galaxy's guardians, the Imperium is its new tyrant, and in the Eldari's eyes, humans have neither the wisdom nor the restraint to wield such power. This perhaps is the greatest source of their animosity, not just hatred, but disappointment. The Eldari believe they should be ruling the stars, not these brutish, short-lived upstarts. Yet for all their arrogance, they know that humanity is not a force to be underestimated. The Imperium, as crude and flawed as it is an unstoppable juggernaut, and if the Eldari push too hard, they will find themselves crushed beneath its weight. Then there is Chaos, the ever-present enemy that looms over all things. For the Eldari, Chaos is not just a threat. It is their greatest failure, their greatest sin made manifest. Slaanesh was born from their excess, and she is their eternal tormentor. Every Eldari knows the horror of she who thirsts, knows that the moment they die, their souls are forfeit. This has shaped their entire existence. The Eldari do not fear chaos as humans do. They despise it on a level that goes beyond mere hatred. To them, chaos is personal, and yet, despite this, they are not immune to its influence. The Drukhari, in their desperate attempts to stave off Slaanesh's hunger, have become some of the most twisted beings in the galaxy. Some Asuryani have fallen to chaos, lured by the false promises of other dark gods. The Harlequins walk the fine line between chaos and order, seeking to manipulate events to their own ends. Even the Inari, who claim to seek freedom from Slaanesh's grasp, wield power that is not fully understood. The Eldari may hate chaos, but they are bound to it in ways they cannot escape. Their relationship with the Necrons is another bitter reminder of their past mistakes. The war between these two ancient races was one of the most devastating conflicts in galactic history, and though it ended millions of years ago, the hatred remains. The Necrons despise the Eldari for their former arrogance, for their connection to the Old Ones, and for the way they once dominated the stars. The Eldari, in turn, see the Necrons as soulless, emotionless abominations that should have remained buried beneath the sands of dead worlds. The tragedy is that, of all the factions in the galaxy, the Necrons and Eldari have the most in common. Both are ancient beyond measure. Both have seen their empires fall into ruin. Both fight not for conquest, but for survival. And yet, reconciliation between them is almost impossible. The wounds are too deep, the scars too raw. The Necrons seek to reclaim the galaxy, and the Eldari stand in their way. There is no peace to be found here, only war. And then there are the Orcs, the eternal plague of the galaxy. To the Eldari, the Orcs are little more than a mindless infestation, a crude and barbaric force that refuses to be extinguished. The Eldari have fought them for countless millennia, yet the Orcs only grow stronger. There is no reasoning with them, no diplomacy, no understanding. To an Orc, an Eldari is just another thing to fight, another enemy to test their strength against. And the most frustrating thing? The Orcs don't even remember the wars they fought against the Eldari in ages past. The Eldari remember every battle, every loss, every humiliation. The Orcs? To them, it's just another good scrap. This is perhaps the greatest insult of all. The Eldari take the Orcs seriously, but the Orcs see them as just another fight in an endless cycle of war. The Tyranids, however, are a different kind of horror. The Eldari, for all their arrogance, know fear, and nothing terrifies them more than the Great Devourer. Unlike the Imperium, unlike Chaos, unlike the Necrons or Orcs, the Tyranids cannot be reasoned with, cannot be manipulated, cannot be bargained with. They are a force of nature, an extinction-level event that cannot be stopped, only delayed. The Eldari see in the Tyranids a reflection of their own fate, a slow, inevitable death, a future where nothing remains but silence. The craft worlds have fought desperate battles against the Hive fleets, and though they have won some victories, they know that the Tyranids are endless. The question is not if they will come for the Eldari, but when. Some believe that the Eldari's only hope lies in redirecting the Tyranids toward their enemies, in pitting them against Chaos or the Imperium. But this is a temporary solution at best. The Tyranids cannot be outlasted. Eventually, they will come for everyone. And so, the Eldari remain, caught between all these threats, fighting to survive in a galaxy that has long since moved on from their rule. Do they have a future? It is hard to say. Their numbers are few, their enemies are countless, and their past mistakes continue to haunt them. But if there is one thing the Eldari have proven, time and time again, it is that they refuse to fade quietly. They are ancient, but they are not yet extinct. As long as there are Eldari left in the galaxy, as long as there are those who remember what was lost, there is still hope, no matter how small. Perhaps they will never reclaim their former empire. Perhaps their days of dominance are truly over, but that does not mean they are without purpose. In the grim darkness of the far future, survival itself is a victory, and for the Eldari, that might just be enough. The Eldari's history is a saga of triumph, tragedy, and a desperate struggle against extinction. They were once the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known, their empire stretching across the stars, their mastery of the warp and technology elevating them to near godhood. But as is so often the case with the mighty, their arrogance became their undoing. The excesses of their golden age led to the birth of Slaanesh, the shattering of their empire, and the near-total collapse of their race. Yet, they did not vanish. Though the fall should have been their end, the Eldari found ways to endure. The craft worlds became drifting sanctuaries of order and discipline, keeping the flame of their people alive, even if only barely. The Drukhari took a darker path, descending into cruelty and decadence to stave off their fate. The Exodites abandoned the ways of their ancestors, choosing simpler, isolated lives on distant worlds. The Harlequins dedicated themselves to a greater cosmic game, walking the thin line between survival and madness. And now the Ynnead offer a sliver of hope, perhaps even a chance at something more. Still, the galaxy has changed, and the Eldari are no longer its masters. Where once they ruled, the Imperium of Man now stands, an empire of sheer brute force and unshakable faith. Where once they fought for balance, chaos festers and spreads. Where once they were unmatched in knowledge and technology, the Necrons rise again, bringing with them powers even the Eldari struggle to comprehend. The Tyranids loom at the edge of known space, a hunger that threatens to consume everything. The orcs remain, an ever-present plague as resilient as they are destructive. So what now? Is there truly a future for the Eldari, or are they merely lingering remnants of a past age, delaying the inevitable? Many believe they are doomed, that their slow decline will eventually lead to their extinction. The Imperium, Chaos, and the other rising powers of the galaxy will squeeze them out until there is nothing left of their once magnificent civilization. And yet, if the Eldari have proven anything, it is that they refuse to die quietly. Even at their weakest, they can still manipulate the fates of entire star systems. Even on the brink of destruction, they can still be the architects of their own destiny. Some argue that their best hope lies in unity. The fractured nature of the Eldari is perhaps their greatest weakness. Craftworlds, Drukhari, Exodites, Harlequins, and Inari all act with their own agendas, rarely working together, even in the face of extinction. Could they ever reunite? Some believe that the rise of Ynnead, the supposed Eldari god of the dead, could be the answer. If the Ynnead movement grows, if the Eldari truly commit to the idea of sacrificing their old ways for the chance at something new, perhaps they could reclaim some of what they have lost. Others, however, fear that even this is an illusion, that the Eldari are too divided, too bitter, too proud to ever truly stand as one again. But maybe survival is enough. Maybe the goal is not to reclaim their empire, not to become rulers of the galaxy once more, but simply to persist, to keep the light of their civilization from being snuffed out entirely. In a galaxy where everything dies, where empires crumble and gods fall, perhaps endurance is the greatest victory of all. Whatever the case, one thing is certain. The story of the Eldari is far from over. Whether they rise again or fade into legend, whether they reclaim their place among the stars or are consumed by the ever-hungry void, they remain one of the most fascinating and enduring races in Warhammer 40k. Their history is a warning, a tragedy, and perhaps a glimmer of hope, all at once. What do you think? Can the Eldari truly rebuild? Do they have a future, or are they doomed to fade away? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this dive into their history, be sure to subscribe for more deep lore discussions. There's still so much to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and we're only just getting started.